Eleanor of Aquitaine is without a doubt one of history's most influential women. Despite this, we have relatively little information in some rather peculiar places. For example, we cannot be certain if she was born in 1122 or 1124 due to conflicting accounts from her contemporaries, though 1122 does seem the most likely. Interestingly, for a woman praised for her beauty, we do not actually know what she looked like. Though she was described as more than beautiful and the embodiment of charm, nobody felt it necessary or even pertinent to record such mundane facts as her hair or eye colour, or, if they did, this has now been lost to history. Due to the fact that at times little was recorded of her, it is often easier to look at the effect she had on the men around her, people her contemporaries deemed worthy of record, rather than herself. Probably born in Poitiers to William X, Duke of Aquitaine, and Eleanor de Châtellerault, modesty did not come easy to Eleanor, and she had a knack for drawing attention to herself. Despite this undesired trait in a woman in the Middle Ages, few took the time to put her in her place. How could they? Eleanor came from a long line of spirited exhibitionists, with her grandfather, William IX, being excommunicated not once but twice by the papacy. The second coming from an event where he allegedly abducted the Viscountess Dangerosa, the wife of the Viscount of Châtellerault. I state allegedly, as in fact the Viscountess was a willing participant in the abduction, and was even housed in a purpose-built tower for her at William's Castle in Poitiers. Although Dangerosa could never become the official Duchess of Aquitaine, she desired recognition in some way. Showing great perseverance, she eventually convinced her lover to marry her eldest daughter Eleanor to William's eldest son, William X, making her bloodline the rulers of Aquitaine and her the biological grandmother of Eleanor. It is not only her bloodline that gives Eleanor her sense of importance, but actually the very nature of her position. She was the oldest child of William, having one younger sister, Petronilla, and one younger brother, William, who died at age 4 tragically in 1130. This made Eleanor heir to over 1/4 of modern-day France, a birthright that was not only larger but much wealthier than that of the Frankish kings. Though undoubtedly her father would have liked to have seen William XI ascend to the throne, he showed no ill will or lack of love to his daughter. In the long-standing traditions of the Aquitanians, he maintained his court as the centre of culture in Western Europe and afforded Eleanor every opportunity to get an education fitting of her status. A complicated man in his own right, William X originally supported the antipope Anacletus II in the papal schism of 1130 against Pope Innocent II and against the advice of his own bishops. In 1134, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux convinced William to renounce Anacletus and join Innocent. In 1137, William decided to make a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James at Santiago de Compostela, in a bid to cleanse his soul once and for all. On the evening of the 8th of April, William and his compatriots made camp by an inviting stream, and, against the advice of his men, he drank from it. The following morning, the men awoke to find William drenched with sweat, and, though he continued his pilgrimage for a few more hours, on April the 9th he laid down and died. Upon his deathbed, he issued his last will and testament. To his daughter, a girl of only 15, he gifted his fief, a rich and beautiful land. And to his overlord, King Louis VI, or King Louis the Fat, he bestowed both his daughter and his domain, in the hope that the king would safeguard them until a suitable husband could be found to rule over Aquitaine in Eleanor's place. The summer of 1137 proved to be a tumultuous one, as while William lay dying, in Paris his overlord Louis was not faring much better and was suffering from a bout of dysentery. Though a warrior king in his prime, as the Reaper approached him, there was little he could do but reflect on the kingdom that he would leave to his son. Unlike William, God had blessed Louis with 6 sons, the eldest being Philip. Unfortunately for Louis, as Philip had grown and come to maturity, he developed a rebellious streak, one that could have perhaps been excused in a normal boy, but not in a future Frankish king. This potential bump in the road was abruptly solved in October 1131, when Philip died as a result of a fall from a horse. This meant that Louis' second son, who would go on to become Louis VII or Louis the Younger, suddenly became heir to the throne. In stark contrast to Philip, Louis the Younger was a godly man whose piety was clear for all to see. As the second son, Louis had been bred for the church, a calling that not only seemed to suit his abilities, but also his ambitions. Louis the Fat often worried about his son's piety being seen as weakness by not only his vassals, but also by outside threats. As a result, he needed some way to shore up his son's power base, a crutch to get him through any potential troubles that could come from upstart vassals or foreign invaders. And, thanks to William, it seemed like that crutch had now been delivered to him on a silver platter. Upon hearing the news of William's death and his control over Eleanor, within hours plans were already underway to marry his son and heir to France's most eligible bride. Before long, the 16-year-old Louis set off on the long trip to Aquitaine in order to claim his bride. No Frankish king had journeyed that far south in over 300 years, marking the important nature of this matter. Unfortunately for Louis the Younger, he would never again see his father, as he would die shortly after his son's departure. When Louis saw his bride for the first time, it's clear that though it may have not been love at first sight, it was most definitely infatuation. Louis adored Eleanor and found her beauty enchanting. On the other hand, Eleanor, a woman used to tales of brave Aquitanian knights and chivalrous deeds, found Louis somewhat less than appealing. Desiring a hunking knight to sweep her off her feet, she in fact found a monk who could be considered pretty like a girl. Desiring a man that could sing love songs into her ear, Eleanor now found herself betrothed to a prude who found her people somewhat barbaric. Eleanor and Louis were married in the Cathedral of St. André in Bordeaux by the Archbishop of Bordeaux on July 25, 1137. Immediately after the wedding, the couple were enthroned as Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine. However, there was a catch. The land would remain independent of France until Eleanor's oldest son became both King of the Franks and Duke of Aquitaine. Thus, her holdings would not be merged with France until the next generation. Louis returned to Paris a king, with his queen beside him. Over time, it became clear to Eleanor that not only could she use her charms to spend lavishly at Louis's expense, but perhaps she could mould Louis into a man worthy of being married to, a man of courage and grit. Louis did make attempts on occasion, such as in 1141, where he attempted to seize Toulouse, a county that Eleanor had a claim on through her grandmother Philippa, though, at the first sign of resistance, he beat a hasty retreat, which only further disappointed Eleanor and embarrassed Louis. Later that year, Louis would once again stumble into a conflict he wasn't quite prepared for, this time with the papacy. The Archbishopric of Bourges had become vacant, and, while vetoing the only suitable candidate, Pierre de la Châtre, Louis put forward one of his chancellors, Cadoc, a man who was in no way suited for the role. Due to this, the canons of Bourges promptly ignored Louis and elected Pierre, who was consecrated by the Pope. Slighted, Louis bolted the gates of Bourges against the new bishop, which outraged Pope Innocent, who, recalling his earlier conflict with Eleanor's father, assumed that she had been the cause of this, leading the pious Louis astray. As a result, Louis swore upon holy relics that so long as he lived, Pierre would never enter Bourges. This caused the Pope to place an interdict upon Louis's land, essentially a ban on church services of sorts, which would have no doubt been a huge blow to the pious Louis. As shown by Louis's attempts to capture Toulouse, Eleanor, though perhaps having little legal power, did hold significant sway over Louis in the early 1140s. She would again use this power to aid her closest ally, her sister Petronilla. At the spinsterly age of 19, Petronilla had not yet married. Strange for anyone, more so for a relative of the Queen. Things ultimately devolved when Petronilla fell in love with Ralph I, Count of Vermandois, a married man with a reputation of being a womanizer. Seeking not to create a scandal and to make her sister happy, to Eleanor, with her customary simplicity of purpose, the path of action was clear. Ralph must secure a divorce. In late 1141, Louis secured 3 friendly bishops, one of which was Ralph's brother, to swiftly annul Ralph's marriage on the grounds of consanguinity, essentially meaning that Ralph and his wife, the confusingly named Eleanor or Leonora, were too closely related for the marriage to be valid. Shortly after, Ralph and Petronilla were united in marriage. These kinds of manoeuvres would have been fairly common practice for the nobility, except for one key reason. Leonora was related to Theobald II, Count of Champagne, a man who had given Pierre de la Châtre refuge earlier that year. Theobald sent a plea to Pope Innocent questioning the legality of Ralph's annulment and subsequent marriage. Pope Innocent's response was swift, reaffirming Ralph's original marriage as well as excommunicating Ralph, Petronilla, and the 3 bishops who had overseen the annulment. In no mood to see the impossibility of his situation, and perhaps spurred on to regain some face in Eleanor's eyes, in January 1143, Louis personally led an attack on Champagne and laid siege to the little town of Vitry. In panic, the townspeople fled into their church, approximately 1,300 in total. As the town burned, suddenly the church caught alight, and, to Louis's horror, not one person would exit their holy site come cremation pyre. Louis swiftly retreated into his tent and did not eat, speak, or drink for 3 days, horrified at what he had done. Eleanor had not marched with Louis on campaign, but was regularly updated about his progress. She rejoiced in the humbling her husband gave to Theobald, perhaps daring to hope that her monk could become a knight. But these illusions were quickly shattered upon seeing her spouse again, a man who could no longer sleep most nights without waking sobbing from his nightmares. She told Louis that it must have been God's will for the church at Vitry to burn, for if it was not, he would not have allowed it to happen. Louis, though, was not so convinced. Louis attempted to make peace with Theobald in exchange for his support in lifting the excommunications on Ralph and Petronilla. This ultimately came to pass, but when Louis's troops had left Champagne and Theobald's lands had been restored, Pope Innocent offered Ralph the opportunity to give up Petronilla once more, and, once he refused, they were both promptly re-excommunicated. Louis, hysterical, and no doubt urged on by Eleanor, promptly returned to Champagne and ravaged the land. It's the culminations of these actions that led many to ask what had turned Louis, a kind-hearted, pious boy, into what many deem now an unrepentant sinner. Conveniently for Louis's contemporaries, they did not have to look very far when trying to assign blame. Eleanor, a spirited woman of Aquitanian stock, raised on ideas of daring warriors singing poems of their battles, was an easy place to lay blame, and this reputation as a troublemaker would follow her for the rest of her life. Eleanor grew to become more and more isolated. Failure weighed heavily on her mind. Not only had she failed to aid her sister, but she had also failed to secure a son for France. She had been pregnant once before, but had tragically miscarried. Now, 7 years into her marriage, she wanted nothing more than to have a son and heir to France, but had not conceived. Though there was much speculation as to her barrenness, Eleanor needed no divine intervention trying to understand the lack of fertility. True to the monk she believed him to be, Louis had little desire to sleep with Eleanor, and she was unable to perform the act of giving France an heir herself. In June 1144, the king and queen visited the newly built cathedral in St. Denis, an opening ceremony coupled with a second round of peace talks over Champagne. While there, Eleanor met with Bernard of Clairvaux, Louis's former mentor and the man who had convinced her father to renounce his support of the anti-pope in favour of Pope Innocent. Eleanor requested that Bernard use his considerable influence to see the excommunication of her sister and brother-in-law be lifted. If he could do this, Louis and herself were prepared to make concessions in Champagne and, as a matter of wrapping up old business, also recognised Peter de la Châtre as the Archbishop of Bourges. Both the content of Eleanor's speech as well as the bluntness of her delivery shocked Bernard. Bernard had a somewhat legendary distaste for women, seeing them as snares of Satan. This distaste even extended to his own sister, who had chosen to marry and raise a family rather than join a convent. One day, Bernard's sister came to visit him in Clairvaux, but for the crime of living a worldly life, Bernard refused to see her and sent her away, declaring her no better than a whore. Unaccustomed to bargaining with women, especially one who spoke so forcefully, Bernard sharply rebuked Eleanor for her lack of penitence and interference in state matters. Apparently unable to take the strain of her position any longer, and realising she had no other option, Eleanor broke down and meekly excused her behaviour, stating that she had been embittered by her lack of ability to have children. A woman of force Bernard could not understand, but a woman seeking the pious profession of motherhood Bernard could totally get behind. Bernard promised her that if she, quote, ceased to stir up the king against the church and urge upon him a better course of action, he would entreat the merciful Lord to grant her offspring. Though he had despised to bargain with her, Bernard had given Eleanor the promise of the one thing she desired the most, the heavenly promise of children. Within weeks, a relative peace was restored to France, and Pierre de la Châtre was finally able to take his place as Archbishop of Bourges. The papal bans on Eleanor's sister, though not immediately lifted, were largely ignored, and 4 years later finally lifted, which no doubt caused Eleanor much joy. Louis, a man who was seemingly only able to sleep with his wife on divine order, set to the task at hand, and in April 1145, Bernard fulfilled his promise of giving Eleanor a child, but, to everyone's dismay, rather than a strong boy, it was a child of the fairer sex that they named Marie after the Heavenly Mother. Despite the peace that had descended on the land, Louis still felt great remorse for the burning of the church at Vitry. Though he no longer suffered nightmares, Eleanor bored at the constant self-pity Louis expressed. This only confounded her poor mood, as she had taken Bernard's advice and retreated from court life. A woman who wanted to be the life and soul of the party, she now played the part of the meat wife, a role she was not suited to. Louis saw only one way to fully repent for his sins: a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Jerusalem. As with all important matters, the trick is finding the right time to actually do them, and, luckily for Louis, just such a time was about to present itself. In autumn 1145, an urgent plea arrived from Queen Melisande of Jerusalem, requesting the Pope preach a new crusade against the Muslim threat encroaching on the Crusade estates. On December 1st, 1145, Pope Eugenius dictated a bull urging Louis and all the faithful of France to take the cross and bring aid to their Christian brethren. On Christmas Day, Louis declared his intention to go on crusade in an announcement to his vassals at court. Louis announced it with his usual lack of charisma, and Eleanor and his vassals were forced to listen to a long sprawling speech as he expressed the penitent nature of this crusade. Unfortunately for him, many of his vassals did not care as to the status of Louis' eternal soul and were less than warm to the idea. Indeed, support for the crusade was not as high as the Pope or the King of France would have hoped, due to the fact that in previous years there had been some disastrous expeditions to the Holy Land, and crusades were exorbitantly expensive. Fortunately for Christendom, or rather unfortunately, due to the disastrous nature of the campaign, once again Bernard of Clairvaux stepped into the fray. News filtered throughout the land that Bernard would preach at Vézelay on Easter Sunday. Considered one of the most holy men in Christendom, the man who had tamed not one but 2 Aquitanians, such a large crowd gathered that the sermon was moved out of the town to a specially built wooden platform. Here at Vézelay, Bernard delivered the speech of his life. The barons that had been so cool to the idea of crusade on Christmas Day were unable to contain themselves. At some point, cheers of "To Jerusalem" broke out in the crowd, and then silence. Louis stepped forward to deliver a speech, but after only a few words, dissolved into tears, prostrated himself before the abbot, and received the cross. At this, the crowd were euphoric. Cries demanding crosses were shouted in every dialect of Gaul, and so many people took the cross that Bernard was forced to remove his own robe and create crosses out of that to keep up with demand. At some point during the day, a second monarch of France took the cross. Eleanor knelt before the abbot and pledged herself to the cause. Though there was undoubtedly an element of religious fervour that drove her, it's easy to see that the idea of crusading was a magical reprieve from Eleanor's current life of meek passivity. Having grown up on tales of adventure that sprang from the First Crusade, now was a chance to see it firsthand, a story for the ages. In addition to the Queen of Jerusalem, Raymond, Prince of Antioch, Eleanor's uncle, had requested aid and sent lavish gifts to entice the royal pair to crusade. Unbeknownst to Raymond, they needed no enticing. Not satisfied with his current work at Vézelay, Bernard continued to preach throughout Christendom, calling for crusade. His most notable work in Germany, where he closed in on Conrad III of Germany. Conrad was hesitant to go on crusade due to failed crops and instability in his realm, but finally at Christmas he was cornered as Bernard detailed all the gifts Christ had given him. When Conrad still refused, Bernard shamed him, stating, "O man, what have I not done for thee that I ought to have done?" The next day, Conrad took the cross and the stage was set. In 1147, the rulers of France and Germany marched for the Holy Land. With that, we end part 1 on our look at Eleanor of Aquitaine. Join us next time when we explore how the Second Crusade ultimately breaks down and the effect this has on Eleanor and Louis's relationship. Finally, I'd like to say that for this video, I heavily relied on Marion Mead's book, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and would highly encourage anyone looking for any more information to purchase it and support her. Thanks, and see you next time.